Okay. Okay, tonight we're going to talk about using desired state configuration in your on-premises data center. And I know you guys just heard about Azure, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to specify that this is for on-premises. Okay, my name is Mike Robbins. I'm a Microsoft MVP on Windows PowerShell, Sapient Technologies MVP, leader and co-founder of the Mississippi PowerShell User Group, co-author of Windows PowerShell TFM 4th Edition, author Chapter 6 in the PowerShell Deep Dives book, and winner of the Advanced category in the 2013 Scripting Games. So normally I have some questions for the audience. I'll just run through these since I can't see you guys. So normally I'll ask who has experience with PowerShell, and specifically PowerShell version 4, because desired state configuration is, you could say it's a new feature, but it's more of an enhancement to PowerShell. And who has experience with writing functions, and who has experience writing modules, specifically script modules, and who has experience with public key infrastructure, and who has prior experience with desired state configuration. And so the information we'll cover, we'll talk about the requirements for DSC and desired state configuration. I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but the acronym for that is DSC, and you hear me refer to it as such probably from this point forward. We'll talk about the basics. We'll talk about managed object format files, the LCM or the local configuration manager. We'll talk about push configuration and pull configurations. We'll also talk briefly about DSC Resources. So let's talk about the requirements for desired state configuration. If you have any questions as I'm going through this, just feel free to stop me. I'll just soon cover them as we go. So one of the requirements, as I've alluded to, is PowerShell version 4. There's a KB article for Windows 8.1 and Server 2012 R2 that needs to be installed. The WinRM service has to be running. You have to have WinRM listeners or endpoints. The script execution policy has to be less than or equal to remote signed. And I also recommend this other hotfix. Both the KB articles refer to hotfixes. And PowerShell remoting is actually not required for desired state configuration. Now, typically what will happen is, and what I'll do, is if it's on an older operating system, if you enable PowerShell remoting, it actually takes care of the WinRM service and the WinRM listeners for you. So now on Server 2012 and 2012 R2, PowerShell remoting is already enabled, so it's not a problem. And then also on Server 2012 R2, the execution policy is already set to remote signed. Okay, and I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint, so at this point, let's go ahead and jump into the demo. And the screenshot there is just a list of the commandlets, at least on PowerShell version 4, and that's primarily what my demo is about, although I do have a Windows 10 VM that runs PowerShell version 5 that I've got a few new things to show you. And let me show you the demo environment I'm working with. So what we've got is we've got a domain controller. I know this is fairly small for you guys. We have a domain controller. We have a SQL server. They're running Server 2012 R2. We have a Windows 10 machine and a Windows 8.1 machine. Okay, and I've already run this to get the PowerShell version on these 4 machines. You can see all of them run PowerShell version 4 except for the Windows 10 machine. And most of my knowledge comes from implementing this in 3 different production data centers, and that's why I primarily work with version 4, of course, in production today. And just to show you that again, you know, on a live machine, this is actually the, there's a dozen commandlets here. So you can see there's 12 commandlets. And if the font happens to be too small for you guys, just let me know. I've increased it already, but it just depends on how it looks in the room. Okay, so let's start out with something simple. Let's start out with like the .NET Framework 3.5 feature. Because if, let's say you were going to install SQL Server, the .NET Framework 3.5 is not installed by default on Server 2012 R2, but it's needed for SQL Server. So let's see if it's installed, and we'll just use the invoke command for that. So you can see it's not installed, so it's false. Now typically the bits for the .NET Framework 3.5 are not even on the hard drive. So it has to either download them or you have to point it to a CD. What I've previously done is actually installed this feature and then removed it so the bits are already on the hard drive. And what I want to show you is when you start, if you've already worked with PowerShell functions, writing a configuration looks and feels a lot like writing a function, because you'll define a configuration and then the name of the configuration and then open and close curly braces. And then you'll define a node inside there. And when you're writing this, you certainly don't want to write it on one line, but this is pseudocode. I just want to show you kind of what it looks like. So then you're defining, say, a Windows feature and the name of that feature, and this feature would be the Net Framework Core, and then ensure it's present. So you can see everything is kind of nested. So as I said, format it for readability. Now what I've done here, I've actually created I've got a configuration called Santa Claus, because I want to show you that the configuration name, although you should name it something meaningful, it doesn't mean anything. And also this portion of the Windows feature doesn't mean anything. Now if you have multiple features, that does have to be unique. So I'm actually going to go ahead and run this, and notice how the code is formatted, that everything is indented, so it's very readable. And a lot of times people will think, they'll see you use certain names for different things, and they'll think that that means something, and that's really what I wanted to show you with using these names, that it doesn't matter. So if I look at the command, if I run git command and take a look at the configurations, you'll see that now I have a configuration called Santa Claus. So when you call the configuration is when you create your managed object format files. And a configuration really is a means to an end. All it is, you want to get a moth file. And the moth file is what you're pushing or pulling to the server. And that's what holds the configuration, and here in a second we'll take a look at a moth file. Because your configuration, once you generate the moth file, you could actually discard the configuration because you don't need it again, but I recommend putting it in source control or something, because sooner or later you'll want to change the configuration of a machine, and you want to be able to start with the latest configuration. Because if you have a moth file, you can't go backwards and generate a configuration from a moth, although that might be a good idea for a third-party product. So I've generated a moth file, and now I'll open that managed object format file. And you can see it's actually something you could even create this in Notepad, but I don't know why you would want to. Okay, so there's two modes of configuration delivery, and I'll provide this code. It's heavily documented. That's for my benefit, and also if you're looking at this a few months down the road, it'll help you put the code in context. So we'll look at the local configuration manager settings for a SQL 04 server. And you can see then next to the last entry is refresh mode, and it's set to push, and that is the default. And if I happen to be going too fast for the screen refresh, just let me know. Okay, so something that I want you to see, and a lot of people, they don't normally show you this, but where these moth files end up when you push or pull them is they end up in this folder. And let's make that a little bit larger. So you can see that normally there's not very many files in this folder by default. So it's in C, Windows, System 32 configuration. And once you push a configuration, and we'll just go ahead and push a configuration so you can see what happens. So we'll push our Santa Claus configuration to this server. Okay, and what I want you to see is there's a pending moth. Okay, so that's not an arrow beside it, but you get the idea. So what happens when you push a configuration, it starts out at pending moth while it's being applied, because if it generates an error, it's never applied. But what happens is pending moth becomes current moth, which is here when it's successfully applied. And it also becomes backup moth. Backup moth is an identical copy of current moth in case the current moth becomes corrupt. And the previous configuration, like what is in current moth right now, while we still have a pending, is actually the previous moth. So those are the moth files that are important. And you can see, and I'll just show you this one more time, make it a little bit larger, our pending moth is gone. And you can also see the date on the current moth and the backup moth are identical, and they just happened a few minutes ago. And then the previous moth is actually, the date is the same, but you'll notice the size of the file is a lot different. And that's because it was modified, because it was basically replaced with the previous current moth. Okay, so we can run get DSC configuration on our SQL server. And it doesn't matter if this is a SQL server or what, that's just that's just my example. But I always like to ask the question, what can you configure with PowerShell? And the answer to that is everything. And everything that you can configure with PowerShell, you can configure with desired state configuration. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the way DSC is a way to declaratively configure your systems. And I'm sure you've heard that before, but what does that really mean? What it means is it's like your boss telling you, hey, I need you to build me a SQL server. He doesn't tell you to put the CD in and run setup and put your databases here and your transaction logs there and all this sort of stuff. He just tells you to make it so, and that's kind of how DSC works. Well, the resources are the imperative portion of the configuration. They know how to configure everything, all the pieces that it's kind of like you know how to, you run setup and you do this, you do X, Y, and Z. You do all the bits and pieces because ultimately something somewhere's got to know how to do that, and that's what the resources do. So we can see the configuration that we've applied to the SQL Server with get DSC resource. We can find out if it's in the desired state by running test DSC configuration. And it is in the desired state. Now the way I like to build these configurations is to parameterize them, very similar to a function. So I'll go ahead and run this configuration, and notice this time I've given it a meaningful name, and even my Windows feature I've given that a meaningful name also. So test environment is the name of my configuration. So I'll call test environment, and with this one configuration I can give it multiple server names and create multiple managed object format files in one command without having to write two configurations. Because one of the problems, especially with IT pros, is they generally come from an environment where they're pointing and clicking all day long. Well, the problem is they bring their bad habits from the GUI to PowerShell, so they write the same code over and over and over. So then you get a lot of technical debt, because then you've got 50,000 scripts that are hard-coded that do the same thing, and the values are different. And then if you ever have some code that needs to change, then you have to figure out, you have to change it in 50 million scripts. So by writing your code dynamically, you can make your code base much smaller, and you can make it more dynamic. And that's kind of the goal, even for desired state configuration. So I'll go ahead and apply that configuration. Now, normally when somebody runs start DSC configuration, they'll specify the wait parameter and they'll specify verbose, and it gives us really cool on-screen output. You'll see that in most demos and most training courses, but in the real world, that's not really how it works. You'll call it, you give it the path to the MOF files, and since I'm not specifying a computer name here, it's actually going to apply it to any servers that have a MOF file. So in this one command, I'm actually going to push both configurations to both servers, or the specific configuration for each server to that specific server. And you'll notice the default is actually to run it as a job. So when I run get job, it looks like there's one job for both servers, but that's not really the case. If I run it with include child job, there's actually a child job for each individual server. And you'll notice that the one for SQL 04 is already done, because we had already installed the .NET Framework 3.5 on it, but the one for DC 01 is still running. And now it's finished. Well, typically you would just run receive job and you would get your results. When I run that, it tells me something there. There's a warning, but that's not really the results I want. So just like when you're pushing a configuration and you want to see those fancy results, when you run receive job, you also have to specify the verbose parameters, see that output. And what I'm going to do here, I'm not going to specify the keep parameter. This is not about jobs, but the more you know about jobs, the better off you'll be. So it's actually going to delete the results, and then I'm going to remove the job all in one command. So there's our fancy output that you would normally see if you specified wait and verbose. So now if we take a look at those two servers and we check to see if the .NET Framework 3.5 is installed, you'll see that indeed it is. So we just installed the .NET Framework 3.5 on both servers with desired state configuration in push mode. Okay, so the location of the default resources on your system is in a C, Windows, System 32, Windows PowerShell, etc. And as users of PowerShell, or administrators, whatever you want to call us, we should not put anything in the System 32 folder. There's another location to put any PowerShell modules that we put in. Only Microsoft should put code in this location. So there's another way to get a list of DSC resources on the local machine, and this actually gets the location where Microsoft puts them, but also where users should put them. And I'll show you in a second where users should put them. So you can see that there's a lot of different. I've actually added a number of DSC resources to this machine, and for anybody who doesn't know, their GitHub is where you can find the Microsoft DSC resources, and they do take contributions. So if you find a problem, you can do a pull request on their code, and you can fix it, and then you can fork it, and then you can do a pull request, and they'll take a look at your code. But I had some code that I fixed a couple of DSC resources. It's kind of what I'm getting at. So you can see, I'm looking, how do I find out what these names, you might call them property names, are for DSC Resources. So I'm looking at the Windows feature DSC Resource, and I can see the properties, and I can also see the property type, and I can see if it's mandatory. So the name on this is mandatory, and then it looks like insurer. I probably need to specify absent or present, but it's not mandatory. So then that's one view, but there's actually a better view that I like to look at. So if you run get DSC resource and you specify the syntax parameter, this actually gives you the exact syntax that you could copy and paste into your code. But even better than copying and pasting is just use a snippet. So Control J for snippets, and there's one for DSC configuration, and this is not something I've added. This is something that's on this Windows 8.1 machine by default. The code is a little bit different than the way I write mine, have their curly braces on the next line, but it gives you the idea, and you can reformat it certainly if you prefer to write your code differently. Because I use snippets. Nobody can remember all of this. Okay, so the program files Windows PowerShell is the location where you should store your DSC resources. It's actually where you should put your modules as well. So all these are the modules and resources that I have on this machine, and you can see the directory they're located in. So maybe I want to see just the DSC resources. I have this other command that I can run, and I just outputted the previous command to a variable, so that's where this variable comes from. So you can see these are the DSC resources that exist in the program files folder. So now I want to show you pull mode, and for the purposes of this demo, we're going to use an SMB file share for a pull server, because for all intents and purposes it works the same. It's more difficult to configure the HTTP, and really you should use HTTPS so that it's using an SSL certificate. But why not use DSC to build a SMB pull server? So we'll go ahead and do that. And I'll actually, what I'm using here, so I'm actually going to create on my domain controller, since I only have two servers, on DC01, I'm going to create a folder called DSC SMB. I'm going to make sure that it's present. Then I'm going to assign full access to domain admins and read access to domain computers. And the local configuration manager runs as the local system. So in order to give your machines access to this SMB file share, that's the reason I'm giving read access to domain controllers. You may want to secure it even more than that. It depends on how secure your environment is already, or what your requirements are from your security team. I'm also using a PowerShell Access Control DSC resource that the co-founder of my user group wrote. Ron Edwards wrote this, and he did a couple of presentations at the PowerShell Summit this past year, so those are definitely worth checking out. So I'll go ahead and run this, and of course it's going to flip me back to my other view, but I wanted you to be able to see as much of the code as possible. So we'll create the managed object format file. Open up our file share just so you can see. I'll do a little trick here to keep that window open on top. So notice there is and I'll make it a little bit larger so you can see it. You see there's not a DSC SMB folder on the C drive of the domain controller. So I still want to keep that open. So I'll push this configuration to it, and notice when it pushes, it creates the folder. Not only did it create it, it assigned the appropriate permissions just like we defined. So to main computers has been assigned read access. Okay, so I was talking earlier about how you can make your code more dynamic. And one of the ways you can do that is by separating the environmental config from the structural config. And what that does is the environmental config is like the specifics, like the computer name, and you'll get the idea here in a second. So let's make it so you can see more of the code. So like I'm using node.path instead of the actual path. I'm using all nodes dot node name, so any node that's defined node.share name. So we're going to define a hash table with the environmental config that are the specifics. So I could actually use this structural configuration to apply the same configuration to more than one machine. And you'll see this in action. So what I'll do, just to make this a little easier, I'll minimize this and go ahead and run it. And so the code I ran is all this code. It's the same thing. I've just removed all of the specifics. So now if I called this without creating a hash table that has the environmental portion of the configuration, it actually won't do anything. It won't generate an error, but it won't generate a managed object format file. So I can actually store this hash table that contains the environmental configuration into a variable, and I'll show you what that contains. And we'll drill down so you can see that it's just a hash table, just like any other hash table you would create in PowerShell. So when you call the configuration, you'll use the configuration data parameter and specify the variable that contains your environmental configuration. And when you do that, it creates the moth file. And it's really the same moth file we previously created that had the hard-coded values. So I'll go ahead and apply this. It's going to run through it really quick because we've already applied this configuration. Now the other thing you can do is store this configuration, the environmental portion of the configuration, in a PSD1 file. And typically, when I first heard of this, I'm like, a PSD1 file, that's typically associated with the module manifest. Well, what I did learn is I thought, well, I'll just make it some other file extension. Well, that doesn't work. It'll generate an error. It has to be a PSD1 file. And one thing with storing it in a variable, you can actually run code inside your hash table, and it generates it and then stores the information in the variable. But you can't run code inside your PSD1 file. It has to be static values. And I think I have that demonstrated a little bit later. So we'll go ahead and create our PSD1 file, and I'll open this up after we create it. So let's go ahead and edit that. So that's what it looks like. It's the same thing that we stored in the variable, but it's in a file, and I actually like this because that way I can put this file in source control. So now this time what we'll specify the configuration data parameter, but we'll specify the path to the PSD1 file that we created. So we created the moth file, and just like previously, it's the same moth file we've created with the last three configurations, because the configuration is a means to an end. It doesn't matter how you create the moth file as long as the end result is the same. So we'll apply that. It applied immediately because it's already in the desired state. Okay. So let's see how we're doing on time. It looks like we're good. Let's talk a little bit about SQL Server. And like I said, some of this it might be about SQL Server, but you can do this with anything. So let's say I wanted to install SQL Server with DSC on SQL 04. So what happens here, what I want you to notice is depends on. It's very important that you use depends on, because don't don't assume that your configuration is going to run top to bottom, because it won't necessarily. You need to use depends on for a couple of different reasons. So if the .NET Framework feature doesn't install, then there's no reason to even try to install SQL Server, because why start something that can't possibly complete? So what'll happen by setting depends on for the SQL Server install on the .NET Framework feature right here, if the .NET Framework feature, if it fails to install, so if it can't download those bits from the internet, or you don't specify the CD, then it's never going to try this step. So I really like the way that this works. And then also, you'll see I'm setting the SQL Server service to be set as automatic, which I believe is the default anyway, but it's also state of running. But this is dependent on installing the SQL Server engine, so it'll never do this step. Also, I've got the SQL Server agent set the same way, which is not the default. And then I also have a firewall entry for port 1433, which is what SQL uses, and it's set on the SQL Server service, because if the service is not running, then there's no reason to have the firewall entry. So I have dependencies set the whole way through this. And I would recommend, if you have something that depends on something else, then you should use dependencies. So we'll go ahead and define that configuration. We'll create the managed object format file, and we'll push this configuration. SQL Server is already installed on SQL 04, because I'm sure you guys don't want to watch me install SQL Server for the next 30 minutes. We'll test SQL 04 to see if it's in the desired state. It is. Okay, let's stop the SQL Server agent service on that server. So now it's stopped. So we know it's not in the desired state, but let's just check to see what it says. So it's false. Now, one thing I want you to notice is it actually tested until it got to a point where it was not in the desired state. So it checked for the .NET Framework, it checked for the SQL Server engine, it checked for the SQL Server service, and then the SQL agent, but it actually never checked for the firewall. So when you do a test DSC configuration, once it has a failure, it'll stop. And what I would recommend is put the things that are more likely to fail toward the top. Or if you can, have those where this is because of dependencies the way it's running. But the closer to the beginning of the configuration you can have the things that may fail, the sooner you'll get a failure, instead of this possibly having to run 5 minutes only to get to the last step that's going to be like the step that always is out of sync. So something else I want you to notice is the configuration mode. There's 3 different configuration modes for DSC. You have apply, which is to apply it one time, never check anything, that's it, one time only. Apply and monitor, which is the default, which applies it one time and then it monitors it. And it'll check the configuration every, every 15 minutes. Because there's a couple of different times here, but this is the one, the 15 minutes. The other option is to apply an autocorrect. And what that means is it'll check it every 15 minutes, and if it's not in the desired state, it'll autocorrect it. So if you have these guys that don't like to go through change control, and they like to tweak a setting, and then next time you work on normally if you wouldn't have configured it with DSC, you're trying to do something on the server, and a week later of troubleshooting, you figure out, oh, it's because John Doe tweaked this setting and didn't let anybody know. Well, if you configure your server with DSC and that setting is set with DSC and it's set to apply an autocorrect, then John Doe is going to come visit you in a few hours, and he's going to say, I keep trying to tweak the setting on the server, and like every 15 minutes it undoes my changes. So that's the fix for all the guys that don't like to go through change control. Okay, so now we're going to push the configuration to the server again. And a lot of people think that's how you correct the configuration, but what we're doing essentially is pushing a brand new configuration to the server, and it's applying it that one time. So now it's, of course, back in the desired state. Okay, now if you don't get anything out of this session but one thing, it's coming up. We're going to define another hash table. We're going to set a credential object. There's a couple of different SQL Server DSC resources, and we're using a different one in this example. It requires a credential, a setup credential. So what we're going to do, I've already imported a credential. So I'll show you what CRED contains. It's administrator. So we'll try to apply this. We'll get an error message. It tells us that converting and storing encrypted password as plain text is not recommended. But then it goes on to tell you, for more information, visit this blog. And that blog just happens to tell you how to override that setting so that you can store it in plain text. Well, what we could do, and this is just kind of a little funny here, we could just say, well, we don't like red error messages, so let's just turn all our error messages green. So no error. We'll turn our error messages back to red. Okay, so what you have to do to store it in clear text is use DSC allow plain text password equal true. Never do this. Never, ever, ever, not even in a test environment. Because I'm going to show you, and I'm not only going to tell you not to do it, I'm going to show you why not do it. So when you run this, you get a MOF file. So if you push that MOF, as we've already seen, it is stored in 2 text files on your servers. Well, guess what? Look at my super secure password. It's in clear text. So that means every server I push this to will have it in 2 files. Well, then you'll figure out that, oh yeah, I made a boo-boo, made a mistake. So then you go correct your problem. You update another configuration. Well, guess what? Then you still have it stored in 1 text file on every server because it's in previous MOF. So until you push a couple of configurations, you'll still have a plain text password on your servers. And this is the domain administrator account. So not what you want to do. What you should do is use public key infrastructure. And I know that sounds really complicated, but it's not. So I've actually created a certificate on SQL 04, and the public key has been exported to a file, and the thumbprint of that certificate has been noted, and that's actually really easy. I have a blog article about that. So let's take a look at the local configuration manager on SQL 04. There's a place here for a certificate ID, and it's currently blank. So what we have to do is tell it the thumbprint of the certificate. So when the configuration gets to SQL 04, it'll know what certificate, because what we've done, as I previously said, we've exported the public key. So we're going to use a public key to encrypt the password, and when it gets to the server, it'll use this thumbprint to know what private key to use to perform the decryption. So we'll create our MetaMOF, which is how what's created to update the local configuration manager. And set DSC local configuration manager is the command that you use to update the local configuration manager. So we just updated the local configuration manager. We'll validate that. Now you can see the certificate ID is the thumbprint of their certificate. So now what we've done in our hash table, we've actually specified certificate file, and this is the public key that was previously exported. So now when we create the managed object format file and we take a look at it, guess what? Look at our password. Yeah, good luck with that. So it's the same password, but it's encrypted now. Okay, and what I was telling you before, notice I'm actually going to query the service names of a machine and build a moth from that. And you can do that when you store your hash table in a variable. And the other thing I want you to notice is I've actually, in my one hash table, I've got nested hash tables, and I'm going to build the configuration for the SQL Server and the domain controller all in one hash table. So I can configure my entire environment with one configuration and with nested hash tables with one file. So I'll go ahead and create that. So, and what I have here, I don't know if you noticed this, but I have role as domain controller or role as SQL Server. So only portions of my configuration will be applied. So notice I'm using the where method. So where the role is equal to SQL Server, it's going to apply this portion of the configuration. And where the role is domain controller, it's going to apply this other part. So I'll go ahead and what we'll do here, since we've got the resolution fairly high, I'll actually run it this way to make sure that we run all the code. Now, one thing I also tell you is the desired state configuration resources have to exist on the node you're authoring the configuration on, but also on the destination that you're applying the configuration to. So keep that in mind for any custom resources. And here in a second, I'm going to show you, we're actually going to use pull mode, and that's one of the main benefits of pull mode is you can actually distribute the custom DSC resources with pull mode. So we'll go ahead and we'll create the moth files. So we created the moth files for both of those servers. And what I want you to notice is I'm actually going to open this just with Notepad. And I know this is really small, but I want you to look at how long this configuration is. And that's because what I did, I queried the servers. I mentioned this before. I queried the servers, and I have a function that I ran, so any service that's set to automatically start that's not a delayed auto start service, it's actually going to set it to be automatically started. So if I set the server to apply an autocorrect, if any service that should be running that's set to automatic is not running, then 15 minutes later it's going to start that service. And that could be good and bad. If you ever manually stop a service that's set to automatic, then it's going to start it. So if you're doing some maintenance on the server, it could be an issue. So let's go ahead and take a look at the local configuration manager again at SQL 04. So it is set to push mode, and we want to set it to pull mode. We're also going to set it to apply an autocorrect. We'll create the MetaMoth I've actually got a DSC toolkit that I have on GitHub, and there's a new GUID command like PowerShell version 5, but I had actually written this even before that. I knew they had one that creates a GUID, but I've got a number of other functions that are real helpful, and you'll see more of those. So any of the code that you may not see in here is actually in that DSC toolkit that I created for myself, because I'm a big believer, if something's really complicated, I don't want to have to figure that out every time I want to use it, and I may not do something for like several months. So I want to figure it out one time, and I want to write a tool for myself to do it for me. And then if I ever have to figure it out again, I'll just go look at the code that I wrote. So we created a MetaMoth. We're going to apply that. And we'll take a look at what it did. So one thing I want you to notice is this GUID we created is now set for the configuration ID. So there's a lot of steps to, or a lot to pull mode, and it took me a while to figure all this out. But once you kind of get the handle of it, it's not that difficult. But initially, figuring it out when you haven't worked with DSC before, it can seem overwhelming. So the other thing is, we'll expand one of the properties here. You can see that it's actually got the path for our SMB file share stored in the local configuration manager. So I want to go ahead and open this folder. And what I'm about to do, this Mr. SQL recovery model is actually required by the configuration that I'm going to apply here in just a second. I'm going to delete that, and then it's going to be automatically redeployed from pull mode. So we'll put that on top. Notice the top folder is going to disappear. So it's gone. So one of the required modules for this configuration to finish does not exist. Okay, also notice there's no files in our DSC SMB file share. Our configuration is almost identical to what it was before. What I'm going to do this time, I'm actually going to run my configuration name as test environment. I'll specify configuration data with the hash table. I have another function called publish Mr. Moth to SMB. My name, like you know, is Mike Robbins, so my initials are MR like Mr., so everything's Mr. So if you want to even get to my blog, an alias for it is mrpowershell.com. So anyway, this published Mr. Moth to SMB will actually go out and query the SMB file share. It'll get the GUID because it's got to be used for the some of the naming. It creates the checksum that's got to be created, and it even queries and gets the SMB file share information, and that information is actually stored differently in version 4 and 5, but I wrote this command so that it'll determine which one you have and query the value regardless of which one it is. So I go ahead and run this. You'll notice I end up with two files here. So what happens is it takes the GUID, it renames the moth to the name of the GUID, and then it actually creates a checksum that has the same name and it ends in checksum. So what happens in pull mode is if you change your configuration and don't update the checksum, the server will never pull the new configuration, because the checksum is what it uses to know if the configuration has changed. Even if it's the same configuration, if you update the checksum, it'll pull the configuration again. So, and if I showed you the GUID, there's the GUID, so you can see it is exactly the same. So I have another tool or function I created in this toolkit called publish DSC SMB or DSC resource to SMB. So you can just tell it what resources you want to publish, it'll find those resources and it'll publish it to the SMB share. And you have to give it the path to the SMB share in this scenario, because the resources have to be in a certain, they have to be zipped up. And what this does is query the version of that module, and it has to be specified in the file name as well with a checksum. So I've got two different modules, or two different DSC resources. And all a DSC resource is like a special type of PowerShell script module. So what I've also done is I've wrote a wrapper around the sim method to actually invoke pull mode on the server from the destination, because we don't want to wait around for 30 minutes for it to check for a new configuration. So we'll go ahead and tell it to pull the configuration. Now, if you want to push a configuration to a server that's in pull mode, if you just run it like you normally would, you'll actually get an error message. But you can use the force parameter to push configuration to a server that's set to pull mode. Okay, this will finish here in a second. Now that it's finished, I've also written a wrapper to query the event logs. And what I want you to notice is over here, I'm going to turn these off. So notice that the module that or the DSC resource we previously deleted is now there. So it was deployed automatically, and that's one of the main benefits of pull mode, is automatic deployment of DSC resources to your nodes. So also notice in the log files, we can see the modules Mr. SQL recovery model were installed, so it actually installed that module. Let's see. Okay. So to me, that's pretty neat the way that works. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about resources. So I'm going to go, there's a DSC resource kit designer, and this will change somewhat version 5. You can use classes in version 5 to create DSC resources, but in version 4, unfortunately, that's not available. So the easiest way I've found to create DSC resources is with the resource kit designer. So what I've done there is I've actually created the resource, and now I'm going to create a module manifest. And I'm going to edit those files that we just created. So what we created is, we created a module manifest. We created a managed object format file for the DSC resource. And then we also created, it's basically a script module. So you have to have get target resource, and that returns a hash table. And set target resource, and that doesn't return anything. And then test target resource, and that returns a Boolean. So now if this was a cooking show, we'd put this in the oven and then magically we'd take the other one out. So let's go ahead and do that. So that module would have actually looked like this. And write your code, I'm going to say modular. Write it so your functions are 50,000 lines long. It'll make your life much easier for troubleshooting. And also, Windows 10 ships with something called Pester, which I think Bo's going to be talking about next month, it sounded like. But you can also get it for your other operating systems as well. But if you're doing Pester testing, if your functions are smaller, they're much easier to do your unit testing with. But notice this, just because you have to have 3 functions that are public, but you can have other private functions. So notice I have a get Mr. SQL DB info function that get target resource calls. And then also test target resource calls the same function. So I have a couple of private functions here, and what that does, instead of writing redundant code inside these functions, I actually broke it out to a private function that's called from the other functions. So try to write your code where it's, and notice the formatting as well. Okay, so now one thing I also write when I do one of these demos, for everything I do, I write code. You notice this says clean up and reset demo. So I write the code to undo everything that we just did so that I can reset my demo, and then I can run through my demo again for somebody else. But what I want to do at this point is jump over to Windows 10 machine and show you a few things that I've learned about Windows 10. Now, one of the problems that I've run into is having a dash in the feature name with Windows 10. Now, I've used the PowerShell version 5 production preview, and I haven't had this specific issue, but I've had it in other scenarios with like IP addresses with a dot in it. There's certain characters you can't use for the feature name. And it's not specific to the Windows feature, it's any of the DSC resources. For this name, you can't use certain characters. So if we actually, and just to show you, so we do have PowerShell version 5. Let's do it this way. So we have PowerShell version 5, and we have Windows 10 Enterprise Edition. So if we define this configuration, we create the managed object format file, no problem. So if you have dashes like that, it's not an issue. The problem comes in when you set it as a dependency. And I've had these configurations and they work fine in Windows 8.1. So it looks like it's fine, but when you try to create the managed object format file, it gives you an error, and it says that it's not valid. It tells you the resource name should be in the format with no spaces. And as I said, it's not, if it was only the dashes and this was in Windows 10, I wouldn't be mentioning this. But it also happens if you want to use like an IP address for this name. If you're doing like network cards, say you have a Hyper-V host virtualization server that's got like 8 or more network cards, and you want to iterate through those and use the same name that you're using here. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's see how we're doing on time. Okay. Okay, so this one, notice the only thing I've done in this one, I've taken the dashes out here, and so I took them out here, and that actually solves the problem. And with one feature, that seems to be easy enough. So I can create the managed object format file. Hey, it works great. Well, the problem is, what if I want to query like my SQL 04 server? I want to get a list of the features that are currently installed. There's a dozen features. So, you know, to do that for a dozen features, that's a lot of static code. And I wouldn't recommend doing it that way. Now, if you are going to do that, you know, you would have to write this for a dozen different things. Now, there's a better way to do it than this, But if you did decide to do it this way, write some PowerShell code that will write the code for you. Here we go. Since these are VMs, they're not the fastest thing in the world. So you could actually write some PowerShell code like this. And like I said, there is a better way, but if you're going to write something that's going to have a lot of redundant code in it, consider writing PowerShell code that will write the code for you. So what I could do, I could actually run this. Let's clear. And notice it generated all that code for me. But the problem is it's still got my dashes in the Windows feature name. So what I could do here is I could actually come down here and I could do replace, and I could say replace the dash with nothing. And then I could actually pipe my output to the clipboard. So then I could come down here and I could actually paste that code in. So then instead of writing 50,000 lines of code, well, no, that's not right. So we actually need a $sign to fix it. So we can come down here and notice now it's right. So instead of writing 50,000 lines of code for all those different features, we could actually write some PowerShell code to write the code for us. But then it would be very static. So there's a better way to do it. So, and I think the next code here actually kind of does the same sort of thing, so I'm gonna skip over it. So what you could do, you could break it up with the environmental config and the structural config, kind of like I talked about earlier. So we've got a structural configuration here, and notice we're using a for each, the for each method, and we're going to iterate through our features. And we're actually going to use an ID. We're going to create a hash table. But this is still going to be, we're going to move an enormous amount of static code from our configuration to our environmental configuration hash table. So this still isn't the optimal way of doing this. And this is how I had done it originally. Well, I did it the static way in one data center, and the company I worked for, they gave me a certain amount of time to do it, so I just, hey, you know how it is, you got to make it work. Well, then when I did the second data center, they said you have the same amount of time, so I took my code from the first data center and I refactored that code and I made it better and more dynamic. So this is one of the ways I made it better, but then I figured out an even better way to do it. So just your code's never going to be perfect, because you'll learn things down the road and you'll find better ways to write the code that you used to think was perfect. So there's my structural configuration. Well, I have the same problem here. I'm going to need to create this hash table, and it's going to be 50,000 lines of, or it seems like it, of static code. So I can use PowerShell to at least generate that, so I don't have to spend all day typing. So I've got this really long hash table now, and that would be okay. Why it didn't work? Let's see. I may have the same one specified twice, because they have to be unique. Let me show you the way that is, I probably got something pasted there that's not right. But what you can do, I don't know if you saw, what I want you to see is, see, I did a replace here. And I'm using the replace keyword. You could also use the replace method, either one of them, in this scenario. So what you can do, instead of writing all this code, is you can make it even better. You can move the replace to your configuration and eliminate all this complexity. So you can just replace it right there in the structural part of the configuration. So I'll go ahead and define that. So then what you can do is just query these features, and I'll query these. Let's see. So if I got a name of these, and I would need that part. So let's get a name of all these. So all these 12 features, just like we did before. And if we specify join, we can actually get a comma-separated list. And I've seen a lot of people jump through hoops to get a comma-separated list. So I can actually run this code and put it in the clipboard. And then what I can do, so I think I'm missing a couple of quotes at the beginning and end. Let's do this. And we're getting close to the end here. Okay, so that at least looks right. So now that's kind of more like your normal configuration would do. It would just be a comma-separated list of Windows features. And I could use a query and actually query that machine directly from inside here. But then if that machine changed and I went and recreated this configuration again, then my configuration would be different. So I kind of like it having it static so it's in source control so that I know exactly what was applied to the server. We still got something. I'm not sure what I have there, but you get the idea with this. This is actually something I created today. Now see, here's the one where I actually I created the configuration on the fly. So if I looked at when you create this, when you run this, it actually runs this query at runtime and actually stores it in this variable. So that's when that happens. So if I looked at the hash table, then you'll see it's got this whole list of features. So then, and the MOF's not going to be right because we didn't create it. But anyway, you get the idea, and I'll figure this out before I post this code. I probably had something different today, and it was stored in memory on this one. But the other one is one that I've previously created and run through it. So let me jump back to my slide deck. I've got a couple of resource slides. So some good resources for desired state configuration, of course, the Microsoft Virtual Academy. Got some great free videos out there. The DSC book is a free ebook on PowerShell.org. The forums on PowerShell.org. PowerShell Magazine. The Hey Scripting Guy blog. Blogs. You know, you could go to my blog and look at my blog roll. Those are really the blogs I recommend. GitHub is another good resource. The two last items on here are the only paid items. There's a Microsoft MVP who wrote a Windows PowerShell Desired State Configuration Reveal book that's published by A-Press. It's the only DSC book on the market that I know of. And then also Pluralsight has some good videos, and Pluralsight sponsors my user group, but I certainly don't represent Pluralsight. And then as far as contact information, here's my contact info. There's my blog. The books that I've contributed to, Twitter handle, LinkedIn. If you want my email address, go to my About page. I have my email address encrypted, and that's a challenge for you to decrypt it in PowerShell. And then there's my user group website. So I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Bo and Jacob.
Anybody have any questions for Mike? Mike, doesn't look like we have any questions.
Okay, great. I appreciate your guys' time, and I'll post a blog article on my blog site on Thursday, and I'll put the code and all that stuff on there.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you guys. Have a great night. Bye-bye.